Ladies and gents, let's get nerdy. Pre-warning you, if you're not into very serious high-end raiding, really it's kind of complex stuff compared to the average player, then this stuff might seem like wild, crazy stuff to you. If you're interested in this kind of thing and you kind of want to know what decision process goes on at the very top end of gaming, in World of Warcraft anyway, then stick around and watch. But I think for many people, this is going to be a very niche video. We're going to be talking about some raiding ideas that only affect very, very few people in the game. But it's the kind of stuff I built my channel on, and this is what I love about World of Warcraft. It is what I love about it. Despite all the anger and negativity at the moment, and people getting confused, like, well, you must hate the whole game. I don't. I don't hate the whole game. In fact, the thing I love the most is actually pretty fine, which is why I'm still around. I know that's confusing to some people who think you should be one way or the other, but nothing works that way. It's not a case of everything's terrible. It's really not. I quite enjoy Uldia and I enjoy Mythic Raiding. So today we're going to be looking at decision processes that I've made since Warlords of Draenor, really. But in fact, Cataclysm, in how I approach the way I handle myself in progress raiding specifically. And more so in WoD and Legion, I did it even in continuous raiding. And this is in terms of DPS. In Cataclysm, that was when I was really full focused into DPS and also had the wonderful experience of chasing world first rankings in terms of my personal damage. This is when I was playing a DK. I loved that aspect of the game. And sadly, in Warlords of Draenor, that was destroyed. Warlords of Draenor was when they really started to randomize the potential of your character, something I particularly despise. Blizzard started to try, I think they had good intentions. They tried to close the gap between the very, very good players and the poor players by reducing the ability of the good players to actually excel. They took away the ability to really capitalize on the power and the strength your character had, and they started introducing more RNG to what your character's potential output was. I would say up until Warlords of Draenor, most of the time, the maximum potential damage output of your character wasn't dictated by your gear specifically, because gear was the same across the board. For most people who were in the same raiding position, you probably had pretty much exactly the same items. Of course, Mists of Pandaria started to change that. By Warlords, they'd introduced a lot of RPPM trinkets that you had no control over, and I moved away from DPS after killing Black Hand Heroic or Mythic or whatever you want to call it there, because we had to do hundreds of pulls on that boss to kill it, and every single time my damage was different, despite playing identically. Like, I was tracking it actively, I've done the identical set of things, and my damage had massive skews in it, and it really made me depressed, because for somebody who wants to try and be the best, that's what I want to do. I want to be the best I can possibly be. I think that makes me an asset to my raid team. Then it was out of my hands, and I didn't like that. It's like, it's actually not up to me. I can do the same stuff and I can play my absolute best, but ultimately it comes down to whether the game rolls the dice in my favor or doesn't, or it rolls average, and it's not down to me. It took a lot of control out of my hands. So from that, I switched back to tank, and coming into Legion, I actually altered my style of raiding away from personal achievement, such as my personal score on a damage meter or whatever, and more towards making sure we got the kill. So we're basically talking about selfishness versus selflessness here. I became less selfish in terms of personal decisions I made during raiding, and more selfless. So this would mean going kind of out of my way and cost myself personal damage in order to make the fight easier for everybody else, and do as much as I could to prevent a wipe. How could I do that? There are a number of examples, but I'm going to use BFA examples today in order to highlight the kind of thing we're talking about. So let's just do a quick overview of what's going on here. Let's look at Mythic Zekvoz. Mythic Zekvoz is an interesting fight for those of you who've not tackled it yet, and for those of you who have, because it's a kind of concertina of requirements. It's constantly relaxing, and then it's constricting and asking more of you, and then it relaxes again, and you have this sort of free time period, and then it constricts again, and you need more things. So, like DPS requirements, obviously I'm playing a mage. The DPS requirements here at the start are rather low. Then the ads spawn and the DPS requirement shoots up through the roof. You have to get these ads dead super, super fast and control them. Then the fight relaxes again until the next ad spawn. Then that's very constrictive. Then the ads are dead and dealt with, and it goes kind of relaxed. And there isn't a real DPS push to get to the final phase, and then in the final phase the DPS requirement shoots up again. So we have these constant waves of when you need to be at your maximum and then when you don't have to be. And with no tight DPS requirement to get into the final part of the fight, then there's room, and this is the important thing to recognize when making these decisions, there's room for maneuver on when you can actually relax your damage and when you can actually go full force. You have this leeway to mess around with. Now, what makes the fight difficult on Mythic is our old friend overlapping mechanics. So we have what are in essence extremely simple mechanics. We have the Surging Darkness, which is don't stand in the shit. No seasoned raider is going to really struggle with that. We have an IB mechanic, which means we need to be spread apart from each other, otherwise it'll chain lightning through the raid and kill us all. And we also have the most important one, I think, which is the Roiling Deceit, a debuff that is put on a player, and then you have a few seconds with which to deal with this, because when the debuff runs out, you're going to leave a pool on the floor. And these pools are very interesting because these pools over the course of the fight will travel towards the boss extremely slowly, but they're going to travel towards the boss. And should a player stand on these pools, it will spawn an ad, and in progress on Mythic Zekvars, it's likely to cause a wipe. Not 100% of the time, but it's likely to be a good reason to wipe should a player stand in these pools. So the obvious reaction to the Roiling Deceit debuff is to place them somewhere where they're not going to be a problem. But that's not all you have to consider. You also have to consider that they're going to move. Just because you dropped it in what is right now a safe space, that doesn't mean that in 3 or 4 minutes time that's going to be the same situation, because this pool is going to travel, and therefore if you drop it in like, it's fine for now, but in a minute's time it's actually going to be a big problem. That's what you need to consider with your Roiling Deceit. And of course, these abilities overlap. So similar to how DPS works in waves, the difficulty and management of the dangerous elements of the fight also comes in waves. Sometimes you just have Surging Darkness, in which case you can dribble on your keyboard and you'll be fine. Sometimes you just have I-Beam, not a big deal. Sometimes you just have Roiling Deceit, and therefore you can drop them in the best positions possible. However, sometimes these abilities overlap, and that creates far more difficulty. And at that point, specifically with Roiling Deceit, you are down at the mercy of what everybody else has done before these points in order to make your life easier. And by the end of the fight, because it's a relatively longish fight, these pools, they're certainly the ones that dropped earlier in the fight, will have traveled quite some considerable distance, and maybe they become a problem. So when dealing with this debuff and these situations of personal DPS, the way I tackle raiding at the moment, or have been tackling raiding with this selflessness in mind, is I know I don't need mega DPS here. The raid itself doesn't need mega DPS here. We're just kind of working the boss down in order to get to the final phase. And it's actually quite relaxed. However, if you're doing well and you've had the good pull, right? Most seasoned raiders know about the good pull. We've had the great pull. We're actually doing really well on the damage meters. There is going to be the thought in your head where if you get something like Roiling Deceit, where in your head you're thinking, well, I'm having a really good pull. I could maybe get a rank 1 here, or a very high DPS ranking, or at the very least be at the top or near the top of the damage meter for the raid. I'm very tempted here not to go as far away as possibly I can, to not really give much of a fuck about what happens in a few minutes, because somebody else will have to deal with that, right? This is a thought process that goes on in every raider's head at some point, and do not lie. You've had it. It's like, well, I'm having a really good pull. I could go the extra 10 yards and make sure it's going to be safe, or I could kind of try and get away with it here. So based on what I said earlier, you can imagine how I deal with it. And I've got a little example here.
Can I get some hots from God's China?
If you didn't hear what I just said, I actually tell the healers, can I have some hots? Because I'm going to China. That's what I said, but I use a different mic for raiding, so it's not as clear. And as you can see, I stop DPS, essentially. I travel as far away as possible, and then when I get to the edge and I make sure I'm going to live, I actually travel a little bit further, and I try and drop it out. Now, you'll notice I went from near the top of the damage way down the damage. And in this fight in particular, this pull here, this wasn't a kill. I actually did this twice and eventually dropped off the damage meter down to the bottom. But I also did this during phases where damage wasn't required. It wasn't required that every single DPSer in the raid was going full force into what we were doing. This was a period of relaxation time, essentially. A wonderful opportunity to go and do this. Now, many of you might say, that's what I would do. But unfortunately, it's not what a lot of players do. It's not a lot of players who are competitive, because of course we are competitive at this level. A lot of players won't do that. And it's been my philosophy for a long time to always do this kind of stuff, regardless if we were on farm or not. Now, the reason I talk about this is it actually became a big conversation point during PreachCon. Before the actual PreachCon this year, I got most of my old guild to my house and we had a barbecue for a good 7 or 8 hours or something like that and a lot of beer. And this subject came up, and particularly because on a Starbro, I forget his name, you know Starbro from Nighthold, I had one of the lowest ranks, or the lowest rank for a Fire Mage. And people were laughing and memeing on it and then talking about this idea, because I'd been quite widespread about it. I've talked about it on my channel a number of times. And I want to point out here, this philosophy has helped a huge amount of people progress raids by taking this extra personal responsibility and personal sacrifice in order to make sure that the boss dies, because that's the more important part. So many thousands and thousands and thousands of people have been following this idea and had great success with it. And I should also point out here, before we get any further, is that the lower down your guild is, the more people can do this. But not everybody can do this, otherwise you will fall behind. Even in, you can only have a couple of people play this way, or one, in order to try and make these differences. Otherwise, overall performance suffers. There's only a few people who can get away with it. But you are relying essentially on the fact that other people are going to be DPS whoring. You know what I mean? You are relying on that, but that's a guarantee. Like, people are going to be doing that. Like, there's no way you're going to get away from that. So you have to be a little bit careful with how far you go with this. But I certainly tried to apply it to pretty much every single boss fight ever. So on Starbro, for example, I followed like the instruction we've been given, which is we blew every cooldown every time you transition to a new phase, and then we would hold cooldowns until the next transition, because that's what was more important, because the fight was kind of going to reset at that point, and we had ads to deal with, which meant I lost out. I was fire at the time. I think I lost out on like two combustions or maybe 3 combustions, which is terrible. But that was the way it went, and week after week after that, it wasn't the case. It was just on our progress kill. But either way, like, this created a lot of resentment from certain people. A lot of resentment. And people were pretty pissed about it. But at the same time, I was doing other things. I would find ways to make our fight easier. So it might be like going near a frost, the frost crystals that spawned. I could wait for the animations to go off while I was about to drop a frost crystal, which eventually closes off a lot of the room, and then go and stand on one that already exists with an ice block, spawn 2 on top of each other, and eliminate one from the fight. And I could do that maybe twice throughout that phase, which enabled a lot of extra space for other people to move around. And also we were dealing with the debuffs that you had to pair up, and that made their traveling around the room much easier. It had this knock-on effect that made things easier for others. So while talking about this, there were some people who were like, you should just do more damage. You should just go for it and do more damage and don't worry about anybody else. And people were like, yeah, you know, sometimes I had definitely several people who I trusted. These are friends who were having a conversation about this. This wasn't an argument. It was more like, yeah, I feel like you should just, I would go for more damage there. I just wouldn't do that kind of stuff because it's on other people to deal with that. And also it's important to have a high DPS of your character. It's important long term to be going for like all-star ranks and things like that. Whereas the actual best compliment I had was from the members of the healing team. They were like, I agree with what those guys are saying. And this was a really great point for me, because I was like, thank you. Like, the healing team, the guys were like, you're right. And you guys, what you're saying is right. It's like going full damage. It makes the boss die quicker. We have to do less. But then they said, but honestly, I would rather have Mike in the raid every single time doing what he's doing, because it was noticeably easier on the healing team. And that was the best compliment you can get. It's like, yeah, you guys are saying what you're saying and going for the damage. But I'll tell you now, the healing team was always happy when Mike was in the raid, because things were just noticeably different. There was just less damage. There was less things going on, less people to fuck up. And it's this butterfly effect that kind of occurs when you play this way. Now, I've started to, the whole point of this video is I've started to change my ideas on this a little bit because I kind of have to. I kind of have to because we're playing much further. We're down the line. We're like in a World 100 guild now. We were World 20th and we're working through the kind of easier bosses now. Our guild got stuck on Fetid. I'm not ashamed of it. We just struggled on Fetid Devourer for some reason and spent 3 days killing something that we then re-cleared in under 30 minutes on our second kill. It was just dumb, whatever it was we got stuck on, and that happens sometimes. It's nothing to be salty about. Sometimes you get stuck. But I wanted to look at Fetid Devourer specifically, because Fetid Devourer is a really good example, as is Zekvoz. So Zekvoz, you can see there that on those fights, I tried to drop the pools into a ludicrous position. I did this every single time I possibly could in order for the end of the fight to be easier, so that we wouldn't have pools to deal with. But as you can see, just from a simple damage meter, how much damage it costs you to do that. But I think it's the correct decision and the correct way to go about it. You just kind of sacrifice yourself and say, all right, this is me fucked. I'm actively doing it. And you can tell from that communication where I'm asking the healers, like, look, give me some hots. I'm out of here. I'm saying I'm going to China, which in raided terminology, for those of you who aren't experienced with this, is a case of I'm going to be miles away. I'm going to be out of range of everybody. Just give me something. I'm on my way out. Now, on Fetid, as I said, we were struggling on Fetid, so this is why I'm leading into it. We were struggling on Fetid. Sometimes we wouldn't have the damage, sometimes we would have the damage, but later on it would cause problems, debuff spreading, all these kind of things. Fetid Devourer Mythic is a totally different animal to normal or heroic. It's a very complex thing. And the biggest thing that you have to manage mainly is the debuff and the knockback. Because the debuff is so dangerous in Mythic. It spreads so quickly that if you're not managing the knockback from his stomp properly, you can easily just instantaneously cause a wipe. So I'm going to show you Scumbag Alley. Alright, are you ready for Scumbag Alley? This is Scumbag Alley. Scumbag Alley is a spot that is in this wall and the one on the other side of the room, because they're practically identical, that completely and totally nullifies knockback. And it also gives you enough DPS range pretty much on 3 of the areas where the eggs can spawn. It's very easy to reach the other 3, and then you can move back to Scumbag Alley. So Scumbag Alley, you can live in Scumbag Alley. It doesn't matter where the boss is. It doesn't matter where it's going to do the shockwave from. You will never move. And the worst scenario you can get is losing a second or a half second or a quarter second on a cast, depending on your timings. And essentially, you can just stand and turret the areas you need to turret and get away with the entire fight there. I'm not showing you this so you can go and use it. Why is it Scumbag? Well, some of you will already notice is that these pillar corners that you have that segregate the areas where the eggs can spawn can be utilized by 3 people with the debuff safely. These are very handy, right? Because there's 4 of them. That's 12 people. More than 50% of the raid can utilize these pillars in order to safely nullify their knockbacks and not get knocked into the areas where the eggs can spawn, because that can give you the debuff as well should you time it wrong. All these things, they don't cause bunch ups or anything. There are nice little niches and areas along it that you can have 3 people knocked into it very, very safely, and that leaves loads of room for the remaining like 8 people to be knocked or to use their cooldown. So if you've got warlocks who can just teleport, as soon as they're knocked, they're instantly teleported back to exactly where they were. You combine that with a couple of other classes who can do the same thing, and it nullifies the stomp. You can make it much simpler to deal with. Now, some of you are going to say, you're a mage, Mike. You also have that ability. Yes, this is why this is a scumbag move. But it's not the only reason. It's also a completely scumbag move, because standing where you have to stand to make Scumbag Alley work completely prevents anyone else from using it. Certainly if you have the debuff, you are taking over. So instead of 3 people being able to use one of these pillars, only 1 of you can. That 1 person will get higher damage than everybody else, more than likely. Very high chance of that your damage will go up. Certainly if the eggs spawn somewhere in your vicinity, you never have to move. You can just stand still and just nuke away happily. However, you're also preventing 2 other people from using it. You've gone from 12 people being able to nullify their knockback down to just 4 if people do something similar. And I don't even think it's possible on the other pillars to find a spot like this, certainly at the north or the eastern end of the room. I believe it's Eastern. Scumbag shit like this is what stops progress in its tracks, because you'll have some bastard, and probably somebody watching this right now, who will be like 100% selfish. Is like, I'm going to use that position because that makes me better. Does it make the raid better? No, not at all. It makes it considerably worse. It makes it considerably worse. And I did this for one pull to try and film it and to try and show how this works, because I know some people were doing it. And I was like, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be maximizing space and being selfless. As well as, I mean, the big thing to this fight is selflessness. It is selflessness. It's not just looking, I'm okay, I'm safe here. Nobody should come near me, because the fight dictates that a lot of people have to move around all the time. And one of the biggest contributors to wipes on this fight is people not accommodating for other people. They're fine, they're okay, I'm good, but fuck anybody who should come near me. And that creates all kinds of problems instead of being ready to constantly be in a fluid movement. And certainly when you're taking up a static spot like you can do in Scumbag Alley, you're making big problems for a lot of people. A hell of a lot of problems for a lot of people. So I was showing this off, and then I obviously went back to doing what I ordinarily do, which is utilizing my ability as a mage to nullify the knockback, freeing that space up for 3 other people, instead of me taking it, which then, you know, essentially I'm taking 4 people out of the fight there. Because 1, I could deal with the knockback normally, because I'm a mage, so I don't need to be there. And 3 people who don't have mobility like I do, say priests, for example, they can't use it in the first place. So it's like 4 people are getting screwed or causing problems here. But I've had to kind of change my ways, and I was kind of debating whether I do a series where we chase rankings again. Now, as the BFA currently stands, I can't really do that, but I think showing progress on how I tackle the fights might still be interesting. And I'm debating doing that on farm content, is how micro adjustments to performance are going to lead to better gains. But ultimately, I imagine a lot of people are going to look at the damage meter, and sometimes it'll be just out of my hands as to whether to do that. As we saw in Legion, I have plenty of rank 1s there. But we could track our progress to trying to achieve it. But whether or not it'll just come down to RNG all the time, and I think it probably will based on the way gearing is now with Titan Forging and stuff. It's kind of a lost cause in many ways. But we can still look to maximize our performance. But at the same time, we're doing bosses at such a cutting edge level now that my philosophy kind of has to go out of the window a little bit. I've noticed more and more, and I'm being consciously aware that I can't really play like this anymore, because there are some bosses where this isn't a big concern. This DPS downtime, the extra movement and things like that, where you can get away with it. But it's more a case of getting away with it rather than it being super helpful. And also when playing with better players, even slightly better players, they can deal with the problems that are going to be caused by not maximizing and making everything as safe as possible. There's less likelihood they're going to be screwed up by it because their individual play is maybe somewhat better across the board. I'm not saying my old guild had troubles with that. That's not a case. But you might have 1 or 2 players who are definitely going to struggle, whereas everybody 18 out of the team is totally fine, right? That always happens. But as you go higher up, the weaker chains aren't as weak, and it gets better and better and better. I have to be very careful what I'm saying, because I'm not trying to offend anybody in any way, but I know you'll meme it until the end of the earth. What I'm saying is there's less chance of these problems being a problem if the team's general skill goes up. Which I think is an obvious thing, right? That's not obvious, and it's not offensive, I don't think, to anybody. And I'll also self-deprecate here, because I think it's important, is I'm not as good as I used to be. I've made many mistakes myself. The selfishness versus selflessness is a difficult balance to achieve. Because you're always going to be working around players who are 100% selfish. I very rarely find 100% selfless people. I find many 100% selfish people. And that creates a lot of problems. You will still, even at the higher tier of the game, look at a damage meter and try and draw some conclusion from a flat number. But I want to see your debate on it, because I'm definitely moving away from the selflessness a little bit. I'm not giving up the full leeway. I still think it's very helpful. But I think it's time to maybe get a little bit more selfish, more out of necessity. The boss needs to die. Much quicker these days, because we're doing things in lower gear and things like that. But what is it better? And this is what I've been fighting myself with mentally. Is it better to make these selfless choices, or is it better to go the other way? Love to see your thoughts on it. As I said, super nerdy conversation on something that affects, like, I don't know, a few thousand people in the entire game. But I'd love to see your thoughts on it anyway. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.